Atlanta.
What is going on, Headliner Nation? Jake, Fantasy Headliners. Hopefully everyone's doing well out there. Welcome to Week 16, the fantasy playoffs, and we're talking about quarterbacks. We're going to start and sit here this week. Full disclosure, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. I'm not going to waste a whole lot of time at this point of the fantasy season. You need to be finding the safest quarterbacks that you possibly can that still have some upside. We're not getting cute with quarterbacks. I have 12 guys and 3 alternates that are starts this week in hopes that you have one of these guys. Everyone else, honestly, and for the most part, I'm really not even considering, just due to the risk factor alone. We're not wasting any more time, though. We're getting right into the content. Thursday night football, because we got football, Thursday, Saturday, Sunday is Christmas, football on Monday, tons of football coming up with the holidays here. Got some tough decisions we need to make soon, because pretty soon we're all going to be in our PJs with our comfy socks and our hot chocolate, sitting around the fire, opening up some fire presents. We don't want to be thinking about setting our lineup. So here we go. Thursday football, Jacksonville Jaguars, New York Jets. And we'll kick it off right here with Trevor Lawrence, and he has been cooking here as of late, so much that I actually went out and I bought some more of his rookie cards. I went out and purchased a few for myself here off of eBay, just because this guy is starting to ball out, and if he can continue this pace for any length of time, maybe I can make a little bit of money off of them. Who knows? Right now, I'm a fan of Trevor Lawrence and what he's done here second half of the season. He's up to quarterback 6 overall, now has at least 300 yards passing and 3 touchdowns in 3 of his last 4 games played. He's top 10 in the NFL in pass attempts per game, passing yards, touchdowns, deep ball attempts, red zone attempts. It doesn't seem to matter. Trevor Lawrence just out there slinging balls all over the field. But just imagine what his numbers could be if he didn't have to worry about so many drops. The Jacksonville Jaguars are 3rd in the league in drops with 29. We could be looking at some huge stats from Trevor Lawrence if they stop dropping the ball so much in Jacksonville. Now, right now, they're going up against the Jets, who are no pushover. They're allowing only 15 fantasy points per contest to opposing quarterbacks and have only allowed over 200 yards passing one time since Halloween. This offensive line, though, in Jacksonville starting to get banged up a little bit. We got Brandon Scherff, Jawan Taylor. They're both questionable, and they just lost left tackle Cam Robinson for the rest of the year. The X factor for me, though, is this. It has to be the weather. At the time of this recording, it's forecasted to have an 80% chance of rain with wind gusts up to 30 miles per hour. There's going to be a little bit of risk in this matchup. You can see that Trevor Lawrence isn't overly high on the confidence scale down below here. Due to the difficult matchup and the weather, we have to pay close attention to this ball game. If before kickoff we open up the weather report, we see the pregame reports, and it's not overly bad, I have no issue starting Trevor Lawrence this week. His opponent, how about Zach Wilson? Now, one thing I can say about Zach Wilson is this. This guy is the best worst quarterback in the NFL. I mean, he can go out there, throw for over 300 yards and multiple touchdowns, make a few dumb mistakes, and they walk away with the team losing. It's just inconsistency from play to play, not game to game, but literally from one play to the next. He can look like 2 different quarterbacks. It's not a guy that's going to throw a whole lot. They don't throw too much for the Jets when he's under center anyway. Only one time all year has he had over 40 pass attempts in a game. And if this dude just gets out of the 20s, it's basically a Christmas miracle at this point. A matchup going up against Jacksonville. They allow 19.8 fantasy points per game. That's 5th most in the NFL. So this isn't a bad matchup. But we know the Jets, they're struggling consistently with injuries on the offensive line. And they have 3 wide receivers on the injury report right now. Luckily, none of them are named Garrett Wilson, Elijah Moore, Tyler Conklin, CJ Who's Your Mama. They're all good to go. So that's not an issue. But right now, people are not relying on Zach Wilson when it comes to fantasy football. And even though the matchup isn't bad, we're not going to rely on him once again. He is going to be a sit. How about we go over to Saturday football now, Christmas Eve, and full disclosure, we got a lot of cold weather out there this weekend. A lot of inclement weather for a lot of teams to really pay attention to. If you ignore the weather on a weekly basis. Make sure that this is not the week that you ignore the weekly weather report. There's a ton out there that could really influence a few of these ball games. We'll start off with Atlanta and Baltimore. So we see Desmond Ridder not do a whole lot in his first ever NFL start, 13 of 26 for 97 yards, no touchdowns, 37 yards rushing, and that was against the New Orleans Saints. However, we did see flashes of what could be a good thing in this offense going forward between him and Drake London. He was trying to push the ball down the field deeper and more consistently to London, so that is definitely a good thing. Now, we probably won't see a whole lot of volume in this offense, maybe until 2023. Maybe we look at him at that point. We're really not considering him, though, here this year. Going up against Baltimore, they're allowing right around 17.7 fantasy points per game, 13th most, and have allowed only 200 yards passing in 2 of their last 6 ball games. Offensive line still banged up for Atlanta as well, but nothing too bad. He's just not a fantasy option here just yet. Neither is his opponent, Tyler Huntley. Really, aside from J.K. Dobbins, there's no other part of this offense that I want anything to do with in fantasy football. He hasn't thrown for a touchdown now in 3 games, says Tyler Huntley. He's only rushed for 1, but that was back in week 13. Hasn't had more than 187 yards passing in a game. Not a whole lot of volume, right? They're really relying on their running game. Atlanta allows 18.3 fantasy points per game to quarterbacks, but Lamar Jackson's still out. Devin Duvernay, he's done for the year. There's just too many other good options that we're not going to risk it with Tyler Huntley. How about the Detroit Lions and Carolina Panthers? We'll start off with Jared Goff. And is anyone else aware out there that the Lions are 1 game away from being above 500? Jared Goff is playing pretty well. Quarterback 12 on the year, has had over 250 yards passing or multiple touchdowns now in 4 straight ball games and no interceptions since week 9. This dude just does not get enough credit from a lot of people. Throwing the ball on average 34.5 times a game, 13th most in the league. Carolina, they're allowing just over 16 fantasy points per contest. That's 18th in the league. But they've only allowed over 200 yards passing 1 time since week 10. So it looks like on paper that this is a great defense for Carolina. But they faced the likes of Atlanta, Baltimore, Denver, and Pittsburgh. 4 teams that really aren't known for their high-powered passing offense. Almost the entire offensive line right now in Detroit, as well as on the injury report, we got Frank Ragnow, Taylor Decker, Evan Brown, Kayode Owosika. No idea if I pronounced that correctly. They're all banged up. They're all questionable to play. More than likely, they should be suited up on Saturday. But this is a team that is playing very well. They're playing motivated, and they're full of momentum as of right now. They've won 6 of the last 7 games, have the Detroit Lions, and they haven't lost a game by more than 4 points since week 7. Lions are actually fun to watch for the first time in a very long time. Jared Goff going to be a start. His opponent, Sam Darnold. Is Sam Darnold playing bad? No, really, he's not. Do I feel comfortable starting Sam Darnold? No, absolutely not. I'm not going to do that. He's yet to throw an interception so far this year, which is great, but only has 3 passing touchdowns in 3 weeks. Hasn't thrown the ball more than 24 times in a contest. A lot of running these days in Carolina, but it's a decent matchup, right? Going up against Detroit, they allow 23.8 fantasy points per game. That is the most in the NFL to opposing quarterbacks, and there's no major injuries of concern. I just don't feel comfortable. I ain't got that warm fuzzy when it comes to Sam Darnold in my fantasy playoff matchup in week 16, so he's going to be a sit. On to Buffalo and Chicago, though. My Manscaped must-watch matchup of the week here. And don't forget, even though Christmas is just a couple of days away, maybe you have some get-togethers after the holidays. Don't show up to them empty-handed. Bring along a few gifts from Manscaped.com. Just make sure you use the referral code HEADLINERS at checkout so you get 20% off and free shipping. And it's going to be a fun matchup between Josh Allen and Justin Fields here this week. Josh Allen does not care about you or your crappy weather forecast. He's going to find a way to go out there and put up points. He did it once again last week against Miami in a very cold and wintry ball game. Still threw for over 300 yards and has also now rushed for 10 attempts in 3 of the last 4 games played. Doesn't sound like a whole lot, but he'd only done that 3 times the entire year prior to those last 4 games, so he's starting to run the ball a little bit more. A fun fact, Josh Allen never faced the Bears, right? So we get a first for that here this weekend. The Bears are allowing over 18 fantasy points per contest, which is 9th most in the league. The offensive line, though, for Buffalo is beat up right now. They're basically held together with like a old rusty paperclip and a half-chewed Now and Later, the purple kind, for sure. Have you ever? Those things are tough. I mean, they're held. That's quite a bit of stability right there, but still not what you'd really like to have for your offensive line. Roger Saffold, we got Ryan Bates, both questionable to play here this weekend in what is going to be another cold and windy ball game. We may not see very many deep shots down the field. There's a chance that we have wind gusts up to 30 and 40 miles per hour, kind of as like a gauge here. Anything over 12 miles an hour really affects the flight path of a football. So that is some serious wind potentially in the windy city of Chicago to pay attention to. Plus, it's going to be cold as balls out there. That shouldn't overly affect Josh Allen. He should be used to that. He's going to be a start still. How about Justin Fields? I really can't say enough about Justin Fields for sure. The transformation that we've seen in him this year, I sure hope the Bears front office has seen as well in the same light, and they really give him some real weapons in 2023. Since week 5, he has 20 total touchdowns and only 6 turnovers, completed over 65% of his passes, and is averaging 94 rushing yards per game, along with multiple magician-esque type plays that we've seen week after week to escape defenders and break off a big run. Now they're going against Buffalo. It's not an easy task. They allow only 14.4 fantasy points per game, 5th fewest in the league. We got Chase Claypool on the injury report, Equanimeous St. Brown, and 3 of their offensive linemen there as well. Cody Whitehair, Riley Reif, and Tevin Jenkins all questionable to play. Like we mentioned, though, it's going to be a cold and windy day, which sounds like a recipe for a lot of running for Justin Fields. His starts may never be quote-unquote safe, but the ceiling is so high that he can win you matchups by himself, and it's overly hard to sit the guy. He's going to be a start. What about New Orleans and Cleveland? And to start it off with New Orleans, has anyone out there cracked the code of Andy Dalton? I mean, I can't figure out when this guy is going to produce and when he's not. I feel like I'm scribbling on like a damn board that Einstein used to use, trying to figure out when is the best possible chance for this guy to score fantasy points, and nothing makes any possible sense. However, I will say, in 3 of his last 4 ball games, he scored at least 15 fantasy points and had no interceptions over that span. Are we overly excited about 15 fantasy points? I would hope for maybe a little bit more, but at least the floor is safe. But now they're going against Cleveland. They allow the 8th fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks at only 15 per game. Offensive lineman Cesar Ruiz, he's done for the year, and that really hurts that offensive line. Chris Olave currently on the injury report as well with a hamstring injury. That's something we need to monitor. Everything else is on the defensive side of the football, which could help if Deshaun Watson and the Cleveland Browns could score some damn points on somebody. But this is another one of those games that could be a weather disaster. Temps potentially below 0 with the wind chill, a chance of snow/rain/wintry mix, and wind gusts up to 50 miles per hour. This guy isn't safe in a dome. I'm not going to tempt it out there in that weather. He is a sit, and honestly, I'm saying the same thing about Deshaun Watson. So many people expected more from Deshaun Watson when he started to play this year. Heck, I wasn't even on board with Deshaun Watson. I avoided him everywhere and told everyone to do the same, and even I expected a little bit more than what we've got from him as of late. 2 touchdowns in 3 games. 200 yards passing, only 1 out of 3 games played. It's nothing really to write home about for sure. Got just as many turnovers as touchdowns at this point. The offense is lost and has no idea who they are anymore in Cleveland. Now they're going against the Saints. They allow 16.4 fantasy points per game to quarterbacks. You got Nick Chubb, who's continuing to miss practice, which could be an absolute nightmare in a game that should really rely on the running game. If you're without Nick Chubb, we got big problems for Cleveland because David Njoku is also still on the injury report. Now, Watson has really struggled to find any consistency in this offense each and every week. Now we throw this weather aspect on top of it, and I am out this week for fantasy football. I don't want to be put in a bad mood on Christmas morning because I started Deshaun Watson and he had to go out there and play in an absolute freaking blizzard of 50-mile-an-hour wind gusts. No thanks, pass. How about the Seattle Seahawks and Kansas City Chiefs? We'll talk about Geno Smith first, quarterback 7 overall on the year, and even scored 17 fantasy points last week against the San Francisco 49ers and really didn't kill a lot of people. That was great to see. Going to need to see someone in this offense step up, though, with no Tyler Lockett in the lineup this week. But how can you not love the consistency of Geno Smith, especially in a matchup like this one this week against Kansas City, in which you know he's going to be facing an opponent that can score points, which means Geno has to keep throwing the football, and Kansas City allows the 4th most points to opposing quarterbacks at 20.8 per game. We mentioned Lockett being out. Noah Fant also questionable, and Kenneth Walker still on the injury report as well. That's to be expected. I still think he will play like we saw last week. When it comes to X Factor, though, Seattle needs to keep winning. They have something to play for. They want to knock off the Kansas City Chiefs. They're at a little bit of a disadvantage right now, missing one of their top wide receivers, but you better believe that Geno Smith is going to be out there chucking the ball down the field once again this week. A safer start for Geno Smith. How about Patrick Mahomes? I think we know we start Patrick Mahomes every single week. He's the quarterback number 2 in fantasy football, averaging over 26 fantasy points per game, and has now thrown for over 300 yards or had multiple touchdowns in every game since week 3 this season. Now, the interceptions are a little bit higher in 2022 than maybe we had hoped, but he's actually rushing a little bit more this year than he has in years past, and that's really making up the difference out there. He has 9 games this year with at least 20 yards rushing and 3 rushing touchdowns on the season as well, going up against Seattle, a middle-of-the-pack defense, right now sitting 16th in the NFL, allowing 17 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, and he could be getting back Mecole Hardman this week. I'm excited for this offense with Mecole Hardman goes to another level if he goes back to the same type of, utilization that we saw pre-injury. The Chiefs have already clinched, but they're still fighting for that number 1 overall spot. I don't expect them to take their foot off the gas pedal just yet. We're starting Patrick Mahomes, the New York Giants and Minnesota Vikings now. Daniel Jones. Somehow this dude is still verge top 10 in fantasy football for the year, however, routinely goes out and has like 160 yards passing and maybe a touchdown. He hasn't had multiple touchdowns in a game now since week 10 and has only done that 3 times all year long. So what that means is we're really overly reliant on his rushing upside. Only has double-digit rush attempts, though, in 5 games all year and only 1 rushing touchdown in the last month. He's only eclipsed 40 yards rushing 1 time in the last month as well. So we're reliant on running, but we're not even getting that consistently. But they're going up against Minnesota. And I think I could throw for 250 and a touchdown against Minnesota. They allow 19.7 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, 6th most in the NFL. Now, there is still 3 members of this offensive line on the injury report for the New York Giants, but that's something we've kind of become accustomed to at this point. When it comes to X Factor, at least the game's indoors, right? We're in Minnesota. The last thing we want to do is play outside, right? So they're indoors. Weather shouldn't be an issue. And I love to start quarterbacks that are going against the Minnesota Vikings for the most part. This risk is just pretty high. As you can see, he's only scored 15 points and is right there on the verge of being a sit. He's going to be like 13th in the rankings, right? He's not going to be somebody who I'm really overly safe on this week. He is one of those extra bonus guys that if you're looking for somebody due to an injury, could fill in. I really struggle with, trying to pinpoint what Daniel Jones is going to do on a weekly basis, but Minnesota has allowed over 400 yards of total offense in 5 of their last 6 ball games, and the Giants have to continue to win. That's why I got Daniel Jones listed as a start this week. What about Kirk Cousins? There were so many. I'm talking about so many Kirk Cousins haters the first half of that ball game last week. And of course, he wasn't playing good, but that's why you don't go to social media and talk crap at the halftime of a football game, because that dude went out, led the largest comeback in NFL history, threw for 460 yards, 4 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions, and now has back-to-back games with over 400 yards passing. 10 touchdowns over the last month of the season. They did end up clinching a playoff spot, but they still have a lot of things to work out in Minnesota, so I don't expect them to slow down anytime soon here either. Going up against the Giants, they allow 16.2 fantasy points per contest to quarterbacks. Garrett Bradbury still questionable to play, and they just lost offensive tackle Blake Brandel to the IR, which is something to also note on that offensive line. But I love what the floor ceiling is for Kirk Cousins. You kind of know what to expect each and every week. Just don't be so quick to hate on players, especially guys with this type of ceiling. They can explode in a heartbeat in fantasy football. Remember, we're not overly concerned here with who wins the ball games or who looks the greatest. We're concerned with who scores the points, and right now, Kirk Cousins be scoring some points. How about the Cincinnati Bengals and New England Patriots? Now we'll start off with Joe Burrow. Joe Burr, which is perfect because the temperatures are going to make you go brrr in New England this weekend as well. At least there's no snow or rain to worry about, but it is going to be a cold game in Foxborough. That just means he's going to have an opportunity to keep cooking, right? 3+ touchdowns now in 2 of the last 3 games played. The yardage totals haven't been overly huge, but the touchdowns have been there each and every week, and that's easy to say when you got guys like Jamar Chase and T. Higgins and Tyler Boyd to throw the ball to. Now they're going up against New England. They allow the 19th most fantasy points to quarterbacks at 16.5 per game, but it helps that most of their secondary is pretty banged up and even questionable to play in this ball game. At this time, Hayden Hurst still questionable to play. T. Higgins questionable to play as well. Bengals haven't clinched anything as of yet. They need to go out there and continue to win, and I expect them to keep the pedal to the metal this week to try to knock off the New England Patriots and get themselves one step closer to the playoffs. How about Mac Jones? Did anyone ever expect the dysfunction, I guess you could call it, that we've seen in New England here this year? Sure, maybe we didn't expect to have, a great team overall. Maybe they weren't going to make the playoffs, and a lot of people had Miami a little high, and we know about Buffalo, but the mental mistakes we've seen weekly from the New England Patriots, it's just hard to comprehend. I still don't know if Mac Jones and Matt Patricia like each other or hate each other. I mean, I know from a fantasy perspective, we don't love the play calling for the most part from Matt Patricia. Mac Jones himself hasn't had a touchdown in 2 weeks of ball games. Now they're going against Cincinnati, who allows the 6th fewest points to opposing quarterbacks at 14.5 per game. Devontae Parker is questionable. Jacoby Myers is questionable. Multiple offensive linemen are questionable. And I also said earlier, their secondary is pretty depleted as well. Home game or not, I'm not trusting Mac Jones in the fantasy playoffs. He's not fantasy viable just yet. He's going to remain a sit. How about Houston and Tennessee? I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time here because we're not starting Davis Mills and we're not starting what sounds like Malik Willis this week for the Tennessee Titans. Sounds like Ryan Tannehill will not be able to go. Looks like he's doubtful. And Malik Willis hasn't done anything really when given an opportunity, right? Davis Mills had a great game last week, or did he? I mean, he had 3 touchdowns, 1 rushing, 2 through the air, had 24 fantasy points, but only completed 12 passes the entire game. He only has 6 passing touchdowns now since Halloween and hasn't even eclipsed 25 pass attempts in a game now in back-to-back games. The run game is banged up. But holy crap, this is a good matchup for Davis Mills going up against Tennessee. They allow over 21 fantasy points per contest, but Chris Moore, questionable. Nico Collins, questionable. Brandon Cooks, questionable. 3 members of their offensive line, questionable to play. I just can't trust Davis Mills. And like we mentioned with Malik Willis, we've actually already kind of seen this matchup before, right? Malik Willis in one of his starts this year was week 8 against this same Houston Texans team where he went 6 for 10 for 55 passing yards and no touchdowns and won the game. And yes, he played the entire game. The reason they won was because of Derrick Henry. That dude went out there, had 32 carries for 219 yards and 2 touchdowns, and that's what they're going to have to do again this week if they want to win this ball game. Tennessee, another team that has to continue to win ball games. It's not going to be easy for him to pass on Houston. We know that secondary has been playing pretty well, even without Derek Stingley there in the secondary. I'm not tempting either one of these guys. I could try to come up with reasons as to why we'd want to, but not in the fantasy playoffs. No, thank you. Which will take us now down to Washington and San Francisco, and not overly interested once again here either. Taylor Heinicke, I love what this dude brings to the team each and every week for the Washington Commandos. I like the deep shots down the field to Terry McLaurin and Jahan Dotson. We're starting to see those weekly. And they do have to keep winning ball games as well. They have something to play for, but on the road in San Francisco isn't the best option for fantasy football. San Francisco only allows 13.8 fantasy points per contest, second fewest in the league. Still multiple injuries here on the offensive line for Washington. At least the weather is going to be good, but we're not tempting this matchup with Taylor Heinicke and then Brock Purdy. This one may be a little bit of a surprise to some people because the kid is legit and he is playing great. He's impressing people each and every ball game now. 3 straight games with multiple touchdowns, averaging right around 200 yards passing or so a game and completing almost 70% of his passes. But here is my concern. The 49ers have clinched the division, right? They're in the playoffs. They know they're in the playoffs. And right now, they're a little bit short on the depth chart when it comes to quarterbacks. They need Brock Purdy for a good playoff run, and he's already banged up and questionable with an oblique injury that he's been dealing with now for multiple weeks. They're going up against Washington. They allow 16.7 fantasy points per game. Debo still not going to be in this ball game, and then CMC himself also questionable to play, but should. My biggest concern here is they don't want to go out there and risk further injury with the best option they have remaining on their team at the quarterback position. I like this matchup. If this game was in week 9, I would probably start Brock Purdy. But being that the San Francisco 49ers have to be a little bit cautious, I would not be surprised if we start seeing rest at times for Brock Purdy so they can get some snaps to Josh Johnson, the only other quarterback on the roster who hasn't played yet for them. You kind of get what I'm saying here. I'm just a little bit worried that they're going to be a little bit cautious here the last few weeks of the season. That's really the only reason I'm sitting Brock Purdy. How about the Philadelphia Eagles and Dallas Cowboys? Gardner Minshew time, Minshew mania for the Philadelphia Eagles, because there's a good chance that we don't see Jalen Hurts this week, which sucks for people in the fantasy playoffs that he has been carrying all season long. But Gardner Minshew hasn't started a game since last year. He made 2 starts. In both of those games, he had at least 18 fantasy points in both games and now has the offense with A.J. Brown in it. In fact, one of those games he played in last year was against the Dallas Cowboys, and he did fairly well. Now, Dallas is allowing only 14.5 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, unless your name is Trevor Lawrence, and then you own the Cowboys, apparently. The only injuries of concern here are really just Jalen Hurts, which doesn't really overly affect Gardner Minshew, but I've got to be honest here. The numbers, there's no way I can get him to be a start, right? He doesn't have any production, any volume. The matchup isn't great overall. I can't get him to 15 points to get him into that start column. But if you want to be ballsy, if you're in a 2-quarterback league, Gardner Minshew isn't a bad option in this offense in Philadelphia. There are so many weapons at his disposal in a system he's been in for multiple years that he can succeed in this situation. He's just not somebody that's going to be in my top 12 to 15, probably more in that 16 to 18 range for those 2-quarterback league players. How about his opponent, Dak Prescott? Shout out to the guy that was all over the comment section last week telling everybody and their mother to sit Dak Prescott because he wasn't fantasy reliable. He looked pretty reliable to me. Now remember, we're not out there, focused on who's winning the ball games and what team is looking the greatest. We want fantasy points, and once again, Dak Prescott is scoring fantasy points. Last week, 256 yards passing, 3 touchdowns, 2 interceptions, and 20 yards rushing. Now has multiple touchdowns in 6 of the last 7 ball games he's played in. Dallas, another team that has clinched a playoff spot, but needs to continue winning for seeding purposes and to really regain some of their momentum. Because don't forget, 2 weeks ago, they almost lost to Houston, and then they did lose to Jacksonville last week. This is a team that has some things that needs to be figured out. Philadelphia allows only 13.8 fantasy points per contest. They're actually tied with San Francisco for the second fewest points allowed at the position. No other major injuries of concern on offense, and the weather isn't going to be an issue here either because they're playing indoors. Even if Gardner Minshew suits up for the Philadelphia Eagles, I still like Dak Prescott and the Cowboys here because I expect the Eagles to still score points, which means Dak's going to have to continue to throw the ball and be a start. How about the Las Vegas Raiders and Pittsburgh Steelers? We'll start off with Derek Carr, and here we go with another outdoor cold weather game. I mean, we're talking about temperatures that could get down into the single digits in this ball game in Pittsburgh. But Derek Carr has been playing fairly well here as of late. Now has multiple touchdowns in 6 of his last 7 games played. I know he's enjoying having Darren Waller back, especially inside the red zone. The Steelers allow over 17.5 fantasy points per contest, 11th most to quarterbacks. And you can really see as of late, the pass defense, number-wise, looks pretty good for Pittsburgh. But they've faced Sam Darnold, Tyler Huntley, Marcus Mariota, and Matt Ryan. Not exactly a list of all-pro quarterbacks, so those numbers are slightly skewed. The offensive line, still pretty much banged up for Las Vegas. You got Alex Bars, Jackson Barton, and Dylan Parham all questionable to play. He may be on the verge of a top 12 play, but due to the weather, I may drop him down a couple spots this week. He does have a good opportunity once again to throw for multiple touchdowns. Pittsburgh allows the 4th most points in fantasy to the wide receiver position, so we're hoping for a huge Davante Adams game, and that's why Derek Carr is a start. His opponent, Kenny Pickett, we're not really considering Kenny Pickett here. Going to be back under center after missing some time due to a concussion. He has no games this year with multiple touchdowns, only 1 game since the middle of October with over 200 yards passing. Maybe a 2023 option that we look at, but not so much here. Despite it being a good matchup, the Raiders allow the 7th most points to opposing quarterbacks, but Najee questionable, Deontay Johnson questionable, Pickett coming back off the injury, the cold weather game, lack of consistent production. We're not going to attempt it with Kenny Pickett here this week, which means it's now time to head over to Sunday, Christmas Day, and to do that, we gotta... That's an extended hip thrust into Christmas on Sunday. The Green Bay Packers and Miami Dolphins will start off with Aaron Rodgers, and all of a sudden, the Packers have turned into more of a run-first team that has some big play upside in the passing game from time to time. They've won now back-to-back ball games, and Aaron Rodgers himself doesn't have more than 1 touchdown in either game. But unfortunately, we have another game here that could be affected by weather. But you're like, Jake, it's in Miami. It's not that cold in Miami. You're right. It's not going to be freezing cold in Miami, but there's a pretty good chance of rain in this ball game, which could lead to even more running on the side of the Green Bay Packers. But this is a good matchup for them, right? Miami allows over 21 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, 2nd most in the NFL. Offensive tackle David Bakhtiari still questionable to play, but this play of Aaron Rodgers has really turned more into like a safer floor play each and every week, because we're not seeing the guy that used to go out and throw for 275 and 3 touchdowns every single day. I don't hate this start whatsoever for Aaron Rodgers. However, make sure you have a backup plan, and once again, make sure you're paying attention to the damn weather reports. They're important this weekend. If you don't want your fantasy championship chances to be dashed by weather, pay attention to what it looks like this weekend. Don't forget, weather kind of tends to change, right? I say all the time that weathermen are the only people that are more wrong than fantasy analysts throughout the year. I mean, that's just the way it is. It's impossible to predict weather from day to day, and things can change, so make sure you keep your eye on this matchup. I like the potential of Aaron Rodgers, though, if it isn't too bad. His opponent, Tua Tagovailoa, down to quarterback 13 on the year, struggled as of late, right? Really due to the injuries on the offensive line and to Jalen Waddle, but hopefully that's behind them now. Really, the only reason I question him this week, once again, tell me what it is? Hey, good job. It's the weather. It's the chance of rain. Heavy rain in this game could really dampen the huge passing attack that the Miami Dolphins have. But this isn't an overall bad matchup for them. The Green Bay Packers allow over 15 fantasy points per contest. The offensive line is getting healthier. Jalen Waddle seems to be good. Jeff Wilson is still questionable, but that doesn't overly affect Tua. Miami is just another one of those teams, though, that has to keep winning ball games. A matchup between 2 teams that have to keep winning really give us that potential for big boom games, because we have players that have something to play for. I'm really hoping the weather doesn't kill this potential matchup, because it could be fun to watch on Christmas. In fact, it could be the only fun game to watch on Christmas, because after them, we got Denver and Los Angeles. Russell Wilson and Baker Mayfield. Russell Wilson going to be back, coming off a missed game with a concussion, which is nuts because it was his best game of the year by far. It showed us that really all he needs is Jerry Jeudy to be successful. But do we all of a sudden want to throw him back into a lineup and trust him? Absolutely not. I'm not going to ignore the 7 bad ball games just because he had 1 good game, especially since at times Jerry Jeudy could be covered by Jalen Ramsey with no Courtland Sutton on the field. You know, Los Angeles allows just over 15 fantasy points per game, 23rd in the league. We still have Courtland Sutton, Kendall Hinton, and multiple offensive linemen who are hurt here. And more than anything, Mr. Unlimited has been overly limited this year and is not a fantasy option in week 16. A lot of the same can be said for Baker Mayfield as well. It's more of a bake sale than a bake show right now, especially after the second time around. He really didn't get much of a chance in the second half of that ball game last week, though it felt like Green Bay had the ball the entire second half of the game. We've lost Ben Skoranek. He's out for the year now. Most of their offensive line is like down to their very last Band-Aid in the training staff. Not a whole lot there. Van Jefferson seems to be open. Tutu Atwell seems to be open, but they're not finding him in the passing game. Just overly limited. Not going to attempt it with Baker Mayfield. And then the last game of Christmas Day, we got Tampa Bay and Arizona. We'll start off with Tom Brady. And really, despite the Buccaneers not looking very dang good, Tom Brady still continues to score fantasy points. This run game is non-existent due to the injuries on the offensive line, so they're having to throw the ball a butt ton. 43 plus pass attempts now in 4 straight ball games for Tom Brady. He does have multiple touchdowns in 4 of his last 5 games played as well, because he's got plenty of options to throw to. Arizona, they allow the 7th most fantasy points to quarterbacks, and I just know that they're going to torch my Cardinals this weekend because it's Christmas Day, and the NFL wants to kick me in my sack when it comes to my own Arizona Cardinals. It is a team, like I mentioned, has a lot of injuries on the offensive line. It's just going to force Tom Brady to keep throwing the football, not only down the field, but to his pass-catching backs. I'm going to start Tom Brady. As for Trace McSorley, not a chance in hell do I start him in fantasy football. Then we'll move on to Monday Night Football, the Los Angeles Chargers, Indianapolis Colts. We'll start off with Justin Herbert, because, man, it's a holiday weekend. I should be feeling fancy right now. Justin Herbert, QB 9 on the year, and continues to throw for a lot of yards. Would just love some more touchdowns as of right now. I would love a game this week. You know what? Seems like a good week for him to have 4 touchdowns this week, because really, he only has 2 total touchdowns over the last 3 games played, despite throwing for over 300 yards in all of them. Also throwing the ball a lot, 40-plus pass attempts now in 4 straight ball games. Going up against the Colts, they allow the 12th most points to opposing quarterbacks at 17.6 per game. No other major injuries of concern here for Justin Fields, and LA is another team that has to keep winning ball games, so you better believe they're going to try to go out there and end this game early against the Indianapolis Colts. I'm going to start Justin Herbert. How about for the Colts? It's no longer Matt Ryan. It's now big Nick Foles for the Indianapolis Colts. I mean, once again, are we lining everything up for a late season Nick Foles run here? Not so much to the playoffs, but at least to maybe a few wins for the Indianapolis Colts. I mean, as much as that story would be fun to talk about, I'm really not going to expect much from this offense, from this team this year for the remainder of the games. Going up against the Chargers, they allow 17 fantasy points per game, which is great. JT is done for the year, but we just saw a team that gave 24 carries to Zach Moss, and I question any team's decision-making when they give Zach Moss 24 carries. You're not going to win very many ball games by doing that. As much as I like Nick Foles, as much as I think he has an opportunity to go out there, I can't just say, hey, it's a safe start to start in your fantasy playoffs, let's fire up Nick Foles, because I would be overly lying to you. Let's see what he does this week. First, he's going to be a sit. So there you have it, my starts and sits for the quarterback position here, Week 16 fantasy football. Once again, Merry Christmas to you and your family out there. From everybody here at Headliner Nation, we greatly appreciate the support. Thank you so much for a great 2022. Now we need to end it with a bang and a bunch of trophies. Looking forward to hearing all those comments down below from people winning their matchups here this weekend. But for now, I'm going to get out of here for the day. Hopefully you have a great rest of your day, a great week, and we'll talk to you later.